Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His kindness endures forever. That's what Moshe Storch was just singing. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Wednesday evening, 1 hour later than usual, because I'm involved in heavy post-production on our movie. Came out great. We had such a good day in color grading today. We're doing that again tomorrow. So tomorrow, same time, 7 p.m. Pacific. Right now, let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Wednesday evening? Yom Revi'i. Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey. Bill in Missouri. Shandor in the Bronx. Paul in the Great Northwest. David in Indiana. Bella in Florida. Melissa in Great Neck. Guy in Ohio. Mickey Stein. The anniversary, you sent me an email about this, the founding of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. I don't think I'm familiar with the story. What is the anniversary of their founding? You'll let us know. Karen in Northern California, Joe in the Inland Empire. And yes, tomorrow we have Tainus Esther. It is a fast day. Normally it would be observed the day before Purim. But Purim this year is on Sunday. And on Sunday, Nina and I will be doing our annual reading in English of the book of Esther, noon Pacific, I believe. That's on Sunday. So the day before would be Shabbos. You don't fast on Shabbos. So the day before that would be Friday. You can't fast on Friday because everybody's running around getting ready for Shabbos. And that's why this year, the fast of Esther was moved up to Thursday. So that's tomorrow. It's going to be a tough day for me in the color grading suite, working all day without eating. But it's a daytime fast, right? So it's not a 25-hour fast like Yom Kippur or Tisha B'Av. So rather, you can get up really early before the fast begins here in LA at 5:41 a.m. Check your local time so you can have breakfast while it's still dark out. And then the fast ends. It's quite late. I mean, it's not just when it's night, but it's fully night. And you've davened Ma'ariv evening service. And then you come home and break the fast. So I think for us tomorrow, it's going to end like 7:37, something like that. So, it's about a 14-hour fast. We'll survive. With God's help, we'll survive. Okay, and also in the house, Marjorie in Georgia. Elle is in the house. Aoife in Florida. Chaim in Florida. Spencer in Connecticut. Welcome, everybody. Our daf today is the traditional starting place when young people, children, start learning Talmud in school. I think in 5th grade they start at the local cheder here. And they would start here with the second chapter, Elu Metzios of tractate Bava Metzia. So we're starting chapter 2, Mishnah number 1. And we're talking quite a bit in the first chapter about one who finds documents, which ones are returned, which ones are not, why do we return some documents, why do we not, what are the possible things that could come up. So here in chapter 2, we're actually going to talk about more basic. What is the law of lost and found items, right? When can you assume that the person who lost the item has despaired of recovering it, and so it became ownerless property? And because you're not going to be able to find the owner, and that's why the finder becomes a keeper, as it were. And when, it is going to be possible to identify the owner, so the owner would not have despaired of recovering his property, and so the finder has to take care of the property and proclaim that he has found this lost property and make an effort to return it to the person who lost it. So let's get into it. Mishnah number 1 of chapter 2. In a case where one discovers lost items, so which of these items that he found belong to him, the finder, and for which items is one obligated to proclaim his find so that the owner of the lost items can come and reclaim them? So these found items belong to him, the finder. If one found scattered produce, scattered coins, bundles of grain in a public area, round cakes of pressed figs, baker's loaves, strings of fish, cuts of meat, unprocessed wool fleeces that are taken from their state of origin directly after shearing, bound stalks of flax or bound strips of combed purple wool. These all belong to him, the finder, as they have no distinguishing marks that would enable their owners to claim them. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda says, if one finds any lost item in which there is an alteration, then he is obligated to proclaim his find. How so? If he found a round cake of pressed figs with an earthenware shard inside it, or a loaf of bread with coins inside it, it's kind of an odd loaf of bread, but okay, he is obligated to proclaim his find, as perhaps the owner of the item inserted the shard or the coins as a distinguishing mark by means of which he could reclaim his property in case it became lost, right? So it said scattered coins, right? So if there were some coins in the street, okay, how are you going to identify who dropped the coins? The person who dropped the coins probably doesn't think he's going to somehow get these coins back. But if there was a few coins in a little pouch, okay, so the leather pouch or the wool pouch or the burlap pouch, so that would be identifiable to the owner. So of course you would have to try to find the owner of that pouch. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, if one finds any anpuria vessels, since their shape is uniform and they are indistinguishable, he is not obligated to proclaim his find because these vessels are like every other vessel, right? So what do we hear over and over again? The distinguishing marks, That's Mishnah number 1. Now let's read the Gemara. The Mishnah teaches as an example of items that one finds without any distinguishing mark, if one found scattered produce. So the Gemara asks, and how much produce in how large an area constitutes scattered produce? So Rabbi Yitzchak says it is considered scattered produce when it has a dispersal ratio of 1 kav in an area of 4 by 4 cubits. And the Gemara asks, what are the circumstances? If he found the produce scattered in a manner indicating that it came there by falling and was not deliberately placed there, well then, even if the volume of produce in that area was greater than this limit, it should also belong to him because there is no distinguishing mark that would enable the owner to reclaim it. And if he found produce scattered in a manner indicating intentional placement, then even if the volume of produce in an area that size was less than this limit, he should also not be allowed to keep the produce, as clearly the owner plans on returning to reclaim his produce. So Rav Ukva Bar Chama said, we are dealing with kernels of wheat that remained during the gathering of grain on the threshing floor. So for kernels scattered with a dispersal ratio of 1 kav in an area of 4 by 4 cubits, whose gathering requires great exertion, a person does not exert himself and does not return and take them. Therefore, he renounces his ownership of them in the normal course of things. And somebody who comes along and finds these kernels of grain and is willing to do the work of gathering them may keep them. So for kernels scattered in an area smaller than that, well, then the owner would exert himself to return and take them. And therefore, we do not assume that he renounces his ownership of them. And therefore, the finder is not allowed to gather them and keep them. Rabbi Yirmiyah raises a dilemma. If a half kav of kernels were scattered in an area of 2 by 4 cubits, then what is the law? The aspects of the dilemma are, in the case of a kav of kernels scattered in an area of 4 by 4 cubits, what is the reason that the owner renounces his ownership of the kernels? It is due to the fact that gathering the kernels requires great exertion. So in the case of a half kav of kernel scattered in an area of 2 by 4 cubits, half the amount in half the area, since gathering them does not require such a great exertion, he does not renounce his ownership of them. Or, perhaps, the owner renounces ownership in the case of 1 kav of kernels scattered in an area of 4 by 4 cubits due to the fact that they are not of significant value. In the case of a half kav of kernels scattered in an area of 2 by 4 cubits, since they are certainly not of significant value, right, they're worth even less since there's half as much, then the owner can be assumed to renounce his ownership of those kernels of grain, and therefore the finder would be permitted to gather them and keep for himself. So Rabbi Yirmiyah raises a related dilemma. If 2 kav of kernels were scattered in an area of 8 by 4 cubits, then what is the law? And the sides of this dilemma are, if 1 kav of kernels is scattered in an area 4 by 4 cubits, what is the reason that the owner renounces ownership? It is due to the fact that gathering them requires great exertion. And this is true all the more so in the case of 2 kav of kernels scattered in an even larger area, twice as big, since gathering them requires even greater exertion. So the owner can be assumed to have renounced his ownership of them. Or perhaps the owner renounces his ownership in the case of 1 kav of kernels scattered in an area 4 by 4 cubits due to the fact that they are not of significant value. But in the case of 2 kav of kernels scattered in an area of 8 by 4 cubits, since they are of significant value, he cannot be assumed to have renounced his ownership. Therefore, one who comes along and finds them is not permitted to gather them and keep them for himself. If 1 kav of sesame seeds were scattered in an area of 4 by 4 cubits, then what is the law? And the sides of this dilemma are, in the case of 1 kav of kernels scattered in an area of 4 by 4 cubits, what is the reason the owner renounces ownership? It is due to the fact that they are not of significant value. And in the case of sesame seeds, since they are of significant value, so he would not renounce his ownership of them. Or perhaps the reason the owner renounces his ownership of the 1 kav of kernels of grain scattered in the area of 4 by 4 cubits is due to the fact that gathering them in would require great exertion. And that is true all the more so in the case of sesame seeds, since gathering them would require even greater exertion. We can assume that he renounced ownership of them, and the finder could keep. Another question. If 1 kav of dates was scattered with a dispersal ratio of 1 kav in an area of 4 by 4 cubits, or 1 kav of pomegranates was scattered as 1 kav in an area of 4 by 4 cubits, then what is the law? Pomegranates are easy to gather, right? So the sides of the dilemma. In the case of 1 kav of kernels of grain in the area 4 by 4 cubits, what is the reason the owner renounces ownership? It is due to the fact that they are not of significant value. And also in the case of 1 kav of dates in an area 4 by 4 cubits, or 1 kav of pomegranates in an area 4 by 4 cubits, since they are not of significant value, the owner renounces his ownership of that fruit so the finder could come along and keep. Or perhaps the owner renounces ownership in the case of 1 kav of kernels of grain in an area 4 by 4 cubits due to the fact that gathering them up requires great exertion. And in the case of 1 kav of dates in such an area, or 1 kav of pomegranates in such an area, since gathering them does not require great exertion, there's not that many individual pieces, so then we cannot assume that the owner would have renounced ownership. We can expect he'll come back and gather his stuff, and therefore the finder is not permitted to keep it for himself. So we had the 2 sides of the dilemma in these, 4 different examples. So what is it? Is it because it requires great exertion that we assume the owner is not coming back? Or is it because what he left behind is not of significant value? And we saw why there would be different outcomes based on the different reason for why he wouldn't come back. And in all these cases that were just named, the answer is unresolved. The sages did not resolve that question. Teku. We shall leave it standing unresolved. Moving on, now we're on page 21b. It was stated, with regard to one's yeush, that's the Hebrew word for despair of recovering it. With regard to one's despair of recovering his lost item, that is not a conscious feeling. Despair that is not a conscious feeling? What does that mean? Despair sounds like a conscious feeling. What do they mean by this? I.e., were he aware that he lost his property, he would have despaired of recovering it, but he was not aware that he lost it when the finder discovered the item, right? So in other words, if you are walking along a river and you're carrying like a stack of books, and one of the books falls off the stack, and you didn't notice, right? And the book falls in the river. Okay, so if you saw your book fall in a river, and the current swept it away quickly, I think that most of us would say, oh, dang, I gotta go back to Amazon and purchase that book again. I'm not getting that one back, right? So that's despair of recovering the book. But if I didn't even notice that the book fell off my stack and into the river, then how can you say I despaired of recovering my book? Now what happens is the book falls in the river. I'm walking along some kind of embankment high above the river. The book gets blown off my stack by the wind. It lands in the river. Maybe I saw it hit the water, then I'm aware. Or I didn't even notice it fell off my stack. But if it went down there, it hit the water. But it just happens that there was a guy fishing in waders, just a little bit downstream, and the book comes along and he finds it, right? He doesn't know where it came from. He doesn't know some guy was walking about up there with a stack of books. He just picked it out of the river. So he can assume that whoever lost this book despaired of recovering it. In other words, he can keep it. Now, in this fact situation that he wouldn't even know about, it turns out that I didn't even know that I lost the book at the time that he found it. So the question they're asking is it valid to assume despair because the person, who lost it would never think of recovering it, even though it's possible that the person doesn't even know it's missing? And so to say that he despaired of recovering it is false, since he didn't even think to despair, since he didn't know it was missing. All right, let's keep reading. I.e., were he aware of the loss of his property, he would have despaired of its recovery, but he was unaware of his loss when the finder discovered the item. So in this case, Abaye said, it is not despair. The owner maintains ownership of the item, and the finder may not keep it. And Rava said, it is considered despair, and the finder may keep it. Now, presumably, if the guy down there fishing with his long rubber boots on, sees his book come flying down, from the elevated walkway along the river, and then he looks up and he sees a guy walking with a stack of books, and then he picks up the book and he looks up there, right? So he can assume that this guy would despair of recovering the book. But since he knows who lost the book, obviously it's the mitzvah to go up there and, return the book. He knows who lost the book. So even though the loser in that case might have despaired, he still should return it. But when he has no idea, right, different question. Right, so Abaye says, if the owner doesn't even know it's lost, we do not assume that he despaired of recovering. Rava says, even if he doesn't know, if it's a situation where he would have despaired once he realized that it was gone, then we can assume that despair applies and a finder can keep. Now, the Gemara limits the scope of this dispute between Abaye and Rava. In the case of an item on which there is a distinguishing mark, so then everyone agrees that despair that is not conscious is not despair, right? The example I gave, a book. Is it an unmarked book? Or is it the kind of book that the owner put his name in it? Then it has a distinguishing mark. Certainly now you can proclaim that you found this book, and perhaps the owner will come forward and recover it. So when there's a distinguishing mark, despair can still happen, but unconscious despair if he had known, does not apply. And even though we hear that he ultimately despairs of recovering his item, it is not considered despair, as when the item came into the possession of the finder, it was in a prohibited manner that it came into his possession. It is prohibited because when the owner learns that it fell from his possession, he does not despair of its recovery immediately. Instead, he says, I have a distinguishing mark on the item. I will provide the distinguishing mark to the finder, and then I will recover my book. That's what he thinks to himself. So with regard to an item swept away by the tide of the sea or by the flooding of a river, even though the item has a distinguishing mark, the merciful one permits the finder to keep it, as we seek to state below later in our discussion. Now, when they disagree, it is with regard to an item in which there is no distinguishing mark. So Abaye said, despair that is not conscious is not despair, as he did not know that the item fell from him, therefore he cannot despair of recovering it. Rava said, despair that is not conscious is despair, as when he discovers that it fell from him, he will despair of its recovery, as he says, once he discovers that it's missing, I have no distinguishing mark on my item. Therefore, it is considered from now, meaning from when the item fell, that he despairs. So it's like retroactive despair. Once he discovers, he realized he lost it sometime earlier. It's an item with no distinguishing mark, lost in such a way that there's no reasonable expectation of recovering it. So we can say that his despair applies retroactively from when it was lost, and therefore a finder of such an item in such a situation can keep it according to the view of Rava, though not according to the view of Abaye. Now, the Gemara proceeds to cite a series of proofs for and against these opinions of Abaye. Right? Abaye says unconscious despair is not despair. Rava says that unconscious despair is despair. And this series of proofs, for the one side or the other, the Gemara gives us a mnemonic, right? So if you were memorizing this in Aramaic, this would help you. Pei mem gimel shin, mem kuf gimel, tes yud kaf kaf, samech ayin zayin. Right, those are Hebrew letters, the beginnings of the words that are going to introduce these series of proofs. So, come in here. Right, all these proofs are going to be introduced with the phrase tashema. That's Aramaic for come in here. Okay. Come in here, a proof from the Mishnah. If one found scattered produce, it belongs to him. So the Gemara asks, why does it belong to him? Isn't the owner unaware that they fell from him? Apparently, unconscious despair is despair, right? So that sounds like Rava. And the Gemara rejects that proof. Didn't Rav Ukva Bar Chama say, we are dealing with kernels of wheat that remain during the gathering of grain on the threshing floor. The owner knowingly left the kernels on the threshing floor because it was not worth his while to gather them. That is a deliberate loss, and therefore the despair is conscious. He doesn't expect to recover them. Therefore, this clause in the Mishnah is not relevant to the dispute in question. The fact that on the threshing floor, the person who brought his grain, to be separated or ground or whatever's going to happen in that processing facility, he's going to leave some of it behind. He doesn't care, that he only took 99.9% of his grain away after it was processed. That little bit that remains, fine by him. So that's not unconscious despair. That is conscious giving it away. So come in here, another proof from the Mishnah. From our Mishnah, right? If one found scattered coins, these belong to him, the finder. So the Gemara asks, why do they belong to the one who finds them? Isn't the owner unaware that they fell from him? Apparently, unconscious despair is despair. But the Gemara rejects this proof. There too, it is not a case of unconscious despair. And this is in accordance with the statement of Rabbi Yitzchak, who says, a person is prone to feel his money pouch regularly. Here too, a person is prone to feel his money pouch regularly. Therefore, it is reasonable to assume that shortly after the coins fell, the owner became aware of his loss. Maybe rich people who have big purses aren't going to notice if a few coins fall out, but most people, only have a certain number of coins, and if some of those coins fell out, they'll realize it. And so it's not unconscious despair, it would be conscious despair. And that's why the finder can keep. This doesn't address the dispute between Abaye and Rava. Come in here a proof from our Mishnah. If one found round cakes of pressed figs or baker's loaves, these belong to him, the finder. Why do they belong to the finder? Isn't the owner unaware that they fell from him? Apparently, unconscious despair is despair, and that's why the finder can keep. The Gemara rejects the proof. There too, it is not a case of unconscious despair. Since these items are heavy, he knows that they fell, and it is reasonable to assume that shortly after they fell, the owner became aware of his loss, didn't recover, so it became conscious despair. Come in here, another proof. If one found strips of purple wool, these belong to him, the finder. And why do they belong to the one who finds them? Isn't the owner unaware that they fell from him? Apparently, unconscious despair is despair, but there too it is not a case of unconscious despair. Since purple wool is significant and valuable, the owner feels around for it, these strips of purple wool, he feels around for them to ensure that they are not lost. And therefore, it is reasonable to assume that shortly after the strips fell, the owner became aware of his loss. And this reasoning is in accordance with the statement of Rabbi Yitzchak with regard to coins, that when somebody is carrying something that is very valuable, if some of it gets lost, yeah, he'll notice. Strips of purple wool, why is that so valuable? I mean, many people are familiar with this, that in the ancient world, purple was the rich man's color, right? Very much so. Where did they get purple? Same kind of source as tichelis, the sky blue dye that we use on our tzitzis. Both of these colors came from a snail that was rare and difficult to procure and difficult to extract. That dye, from snails in any quantity. So, somebody who had purple strips of wool was holding something quite valuable. And if he lost some of them and didn't come back, he would notice. So the fact that, he doesn't come back, or that it's a situation where he's not going to be able, he would notice that he lost, even though he's unable to recover it. Therefore, we're not talking about unconscious despair. That would be conscious despair, and that's why the owner can keep such things. Again, with no identifying marks. Now, you could certainly say, well, wait a minute, strips of purple wool, I mean, that sounds like in itself it's identifiable, the number of strips, etc. And I would agree with you, and I think the Gemara would agree with you. But if they were, if they were, I don't know, if it was common enough, these strips of wool that they would be considered valuable and yet not identifiable, because wherever these strips of purple wool exist, they all look alike. Then that would be the situation where the finder could keep. So, come in here another proof from a Baraisa instead of from our Mishnah. In the case of one who finds coins in synagogues and in study halls and in any place where the multitudes are found. This is like finding coins in the street. These coins belong to him due to the fact that the owners despair of their recovery. Why do they belong to the finder? Isn't the owner unaware that the coins fell from him? Must be unconscious despair. But Rabbi Yitzchak says a person is prone to feel his money pouch regularly. Therefore, it is reasonable to assume that shortly after the coins fell, the owner became aware of the loss. It's not unconscious despair, it's conscious despair. Come in here a proof from a Mishnah, Tractate Peah. From when is it permitted for any person to collect gleanings, which the Torah designates as exclusively for the poor, right? So when people harvest their field, we've talked many times, they leave the corners for the poor, and the gleanings which fall and were not gathered, they're just left on the ground, and the poor can come and gather those gleanings. Also, forgotten sheaves are left for the poor. So about these gleanings, from when is it permitted for any person to collect gleanings? Meaning not necessarily a poor person, right? So poor people get the gleanings. So what does it mean that from when may other people get gleanings? When any person. So that must mean that there's an expiration date, right, on when the poor can gather those gleanings, and after that, anyone can gather them. So how does this work? So it is permitted once the nemushot have walked in the field. And we say, in interpreting the Mishnah, what are nemushot? And Rabbi Yochanan said they are the elderly people who walk leaning on a cane. Since they walk slowly, they will see any stalks that remain and take them. And Reish Lakish said they are the second wave of gleaners who pass through the field after the initial gleaners, collecting any stalks that remain. And so the Gemara asks, and why is it permitted for any person to take the stalks, given that although the poor who are here renounce ownership of the stalks after seeing the nemushot pass through the field, there are poor people in some other place who are unaware of the passing of the nemushot in this field, and they do not renounce their ownership of the gleanings here. So apparently despair that is not conscious, unconscious despair, is considered despair. And the sages say, in rejection of this proof, since there are poor people here, those poor people in other places despair of the gleanings from the outset. As they say, the poor people who are on that field, they're going to gather whatever gleanings are there. I'm not going to go there after, a bunch of poor people have gone through that field. They're going to gather everything. So poor people who are not present here, they have despaired of recovering any gleanings from that field because there are poor people here who will gather those gleanings. And once the first wave and then a second wave of poor people went through that field, so then the poor people who are locally present, they have despaired of taking anything that's left behind, right? Because they made their sweep of that field. So at that point, the poor, as it were, have renounced ownership of whatever's left. And that's why a person can come along after the two waves of poor people have gone through the field, that even if he's not poor, he can gather whatever gleaning here or there is left. Who's going to do that, right? The poor come because they need it. Now we're talking about somebody who's not even poor, and there's almost nothing left. So it's not like anyone's coming along. We're really just testing our understanding of the law. So come in here, another proof that would seem to indicate that Abaye is correct. That Rava is correct and Abaye is wrong, and that unconscious despair is despair. And then let's see if this proof works. Come in here, a proof from a Mishnah, Tractate Masrot 3:4. If dried figs are found on the path, and even if they were found at the side of a field where dried figs are spread to dry, and likewise if there is a fig tree whose branches extend over a path, and one found figs beneath it, so those figs are permitted, and taking them is not prohibited due to the prohibition of robbery. And as these are ownerless property, one who finds them is exempt from the obligation to separate tithes. It's not like somebody who harvested a fig tree. They just found ownerless property, so you don't have to tithe it. In the case of olives or of carobs, it is prohibited to take the fruit, right? So olives and carobs, which seem to be more significant than figs, you can't take even if they're left there ownerless, but figs you can. Now, granted, the first clause of the Mishnah is not difficult, according to the opinion of Abaye, as he can explain that one consciously despairs of recovering the dried figs. Since dried figs are significant and valuable, one feels around for them to ensure that they have not become lost. It is reasonable to assume that shortly after the fruits fell, the owner became aware of his loss and despaired of recovering them. In the case of the fig tree also, one knows that it is a common occurrence for the fruit of the tree to fall from the tree, and he renounces ownership from the outset. So that is not unconscious despair, that is conscious despair. And this squares with Abaye. But the latter clause of the Mishnah is difficult according to the opinion of Rava, as it teaches in the case of olives or carobs, it is prohibited to take the fruit. So apparently, unconscious despair is not despair. Rabbi Abahu said the law of an olive is different, since its appearance proves the identity of the owner, as the fruit fallen from the tree appears similar to the fruit on that tree. And even though the olives fall off the tree, the one who finds the olives knows that an olive tree that is located in a place that is owned by a specific person belongs to that person. And the owner will not renounce ownership of his olives because they are valuable. I'm very close to done. So if you've got questions or comments, please get them in now. And finally, the Gemara asks, if so, then even in the first clause as well, it should be prohibited to take the fruit that fell from the fig tree. And Rav Papa said a fig becomes disgusting with its fall from the tree, even if the fruit can be attributed to the tree of origin. Since it is no longer fit for consumption, the owner would not want the fruit and consequently renounces his ownership of it. And tomorrow, God willing, at 7 p.m. Pacific, 1 hour later than normal, just like today, we'll continue to examine this dispute between Abaye and Rava over the question, is the owner who lost something, is his unconscious despair of recovering it considered despair, meaning he has despaired of recovering it, and therefore somebody who comes along and finds it is permitted to keep it? Or do we hold, like Abaye, that unconscious despair is not despair, and therefore the finder cannot keep it in that situation? Nina is asking me to announce that tomorrow there is a worldwide Shema at 11:30 a.m. Eastern, so that would be 8:30 a.m. Pacific. Remember, this is a fast, the fast of Esther. What are we commemorating? Excuse me. That in the Purim story, right, where the wicked Haman, one of the greatest anti-Semites in history, convinced the king to allow him, Haman, to issue a decree that all the Jews in the world would be murdered on the same day. And, through the series of events described in the book of Esther, the decree was annulled and reversed, and the Jews were able to triumph over their enemies, and the wicked Haman was executed, etc. And the Jews had light and gladness, joy and honor, and we celebrate Purim. But one of the important events in that story is that when there was this mortal threat that all the Jews in the world were going to be killed, everyone cried out to God. All the Jews in the world cried out to God and fasted. And that's why we fast. And it's not enough not to just not eat. We also need to cry out to God. Please, God, save us. End this war with a secure and lasting peace for Eretz Yisrael and Am Yisrael, right? For the land of Israel and the nation of Israel everywhere. And please, God, bring home the hostages now. Please, God, right? So we cry out to God. We pray. We say it out loud with our lips. And we do that in conjunction with the fast and saying this worldwide Shema at 11:30 a.m. tomorrow, Eastern Time, 8:30 Pacific. And also on Sunday during Purim, Nina and I will do our annual reading in English of the Book of Esther here on Facebook and YouTube. Okay, Bill. Oh, I think I know what the loaf of bread with a coin in it is. I said that was a little weird, right? Identifying Mark have a loaf of bread with a coin in it. So, says Bill, I grew up about an hour's drive from the Mississippi River, and there was a superstition. I think Mark Twain actually references it in either Tom Sawyer or Huck Finn, but I can't remember which, that a silver coin placed in a loaf of bread would bring various forms of luck and could be used to find lost items in the river because supposedly the bread would float over the lost thing. Superstitions are odd things. They survive in strange ways, and maybe there was a similar belief in Bava. That is very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I'm sure there was something, right? They didn't just make it up as a total weirdness. There is the, what's it called? The Schlissel challah, right? Schlissel challah. That we make, right? It's a challah with a baked in the shape of a key, and often with an actual key baked into it, which brings good fortune. And maybe this is a similar type of thing. I forget when we do the Schlissel challah, right? When is that, Nina? Is it after Purim? Is it after we come out of Passover? I can't remember right now when we do that. You'll remind me. Joseph, when you see come in here, is that an indication of that a law is coming after that? Well, in this case, it was an indication that proofs are being offered, right? An argument is being offered that sounds like it'll be conclusive, but it's not. Okay, the Schlissel challah is the first Shabbos after Passover. That wasn't so far off. And Melly Holmes says, was there gold wool? Gold wool? Like the golden fleece? I don't know. I don't think so. I mean, maybe there was a type of wool that the sheep, had a somewhat coloration that you might call that. I think in, Greek mythology, when they're talking about the golden fleece, that really was made out of gold. But that's a totally different ball of fleece, as it were. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, 1 hour later than our regular time. So tomorrow at 7 p.m. Pacific. Oh my gosh, and we'll still be fasting at that time. Okay, all right. So, hungry and all, teach, teach, teach. All the best, my holy sisters and brothers. Have a great night.